I just bought my first sewing machine. To be clear, that's not, I bought my first sewing machine. It's more like I have for the first time purchased a sewing machine, because the one that I have been using for years and years and years at this point is technically was not bought by me nor for me. This is Mr. Morgan Donner's sewing machine that his late mother gave to him before we ever met, and I think that she would be so happy that I use it literally all the time. But I was also very excited to finally have the chance to buy my own machine, which I'm so excited. It's technically not a sewing machine as you might typically think of them. It's a serger slash overlocker. I am so excited to open her up and have a look. So let's have ourselves a very mini unboxing situation. Make sure that I have all the bits and bobs that are supposed to be in here. Instructions. Okay, I think I need to move the box to the floor. One moment. Whew. Look at them together, being so cute. It's so shiny and new. Let's get rid of the rest of the packaging. Now that everything is de-packaged, we can go ahead and have a good long look at the user manual here. I'm going to attempt to read this cover to cover before touching anything else. Seems like a good plan. I have now had a look at every word of the user's guide, and we have a few different little preparatory steps before we begin with any actual stitching. And first off is going to be connecting the foot control and power supply. Then before using the machine for the first time, they want us to let it run for a little bit so that any oils that have been kind of just sitting here while it's in, shipping, waiting to be sold mode, can get distributed properly. Then we're going to mount the spool stand, mount the telescopic thread stand, mount the waist tray, the knee lifter. We're going to add the flatbed extension and make sure that that is functional and looking good. Then we're going to install our needles, of which there are 5 potential spots to put needles in. I have all my bits and bobs in place now, except for my threads, which I feel like everyone says this is the part that is the biggest pain in the butt when it comes to serging, because it's a little complicated and it just makes it so that folks don't use their machine as they might as much as they might otherwise. The machine actually did come pre-threaded, sort of. It came with like a little rainbow of tails corresponding to the yellow, blue, red, green dots on the top of the stitch here. I thought about leaving them. I really thought about it. But one, the instructions do say to run the machine for a bit without any thread in it to help kind of get stuff moving. But also, I know that it is probably good for me to get some practice in and learn how to thread it up myself. So that's what we're gonna do. I figure there's like 10, I think, different stitches that this theoretically can do, and a lot of them are gonna require re-threading. Earlier I mentioned something about there being 5 needles. You don't actually use all of the needles at any given point. You move them around and thread the needle depending on what kind of stitch you're doing, and it means a lot of re-threading your machine. I feel like the best way to get better at it is to practice, so let's play around with some stitches. I have now done almost all of the stitches available to do in the machine. Some of them are basically the same stitch, but there's a wider variation versus a narrower variation, and I started to skip some of those. That way I wasn't repeating the same stitches essentially over and over. So I did the vast majority of stitches available to do on this machine, and it was really fun as I went along to kind of recognize how the different seams were working and what they're good for. Like, some are meant to be super stretchy. Some of the stitches are meant for really lightweight fabric so it doesn't weigh it down with big bulky seams. Some of them do just the most beautiful finished edges that I'm really looking forward to doing more of these. They're so tidy. I'm a big fan. There's also, stitches for heavier use. Like, this is the safety stitch, and the idea is that it has two bits of sewing that are both intended to hold the fabric together. So if the first row breaks, you have like a second line of defense. I will say, I wanted to get familiar with my machine, and by golly, I feel like I've gone from half an hour to do my very first initial setup with the threading and the needles and everything to now I think I could switch out the whole thing in maybe 5 minutes. Just for giggles, I need to change this anyway from the cover lock stitch that it's currently on back to the safety stitch. Let's test whether or not it indeed only takes me 5 minutes, because that's a lot of changes that I need to do to make that happen. So it's a good test. All right, I was mistaken about 5 minutes. So as it turns out, I guess I'm not quite as fast as I thought I was, but I'm still pretty happy that it took under 8 minutes to do completely polar opposite stitch changes, because settings wise, along with redoing the thread and everything. Like, it's not bad, and I definitely do feel like I understand the machine better now. Better enough, perhaps, to even take on sewing a project. I just got this thin, like t-shirt weight cotton knit jersey fabric that will make, I think, a lovely pair of shirts. And because I think this would be very fun, I want to do one shirt on my lovely new Serger here and one shirt on my good old-fashioned tried and true regular sewing machine. I think this would be a lot of fun. First up, of course, is going to be cutting out our pieces. I don't already have a pattern specifically for knit t-shirts, but I'm fairly hopeful that I can just go take a shirt existing within my wardrobe and plop it down, trace it out, and that'll be a sufficiently good enough pattern. For the front half of the shirt, I'm just going to fold the fabric in half for symmetry and then eyeball that lowered neckline situation. The nice thing here about stretch knit fabrics that I'm working with is that it's going to be okay if my pattern isn't perfect. It'll still stretch to fit me really nicely just because that's the nature of the fabric. Alrighty, I have my two identical shirt patterns cut out. I think that they will work just fine. I have my machines both set up, ballpoint needles, same color thread, all that jazz. So let's get to sewing. I am excited to see how this goes. First off is sewing the shoulder seams, and that's going to be just one step on the serger, but 2 steps on the regular sewing machine, since first I need to actually sew the seam that stitches the 2 pieces of fabric together, and then separately I'm going to zigzag the seam allowances. Then we can pop on our sleeves, going from the center first and then matching the outside points from there. Same deal here, it's going to be 1 stitch for the overlocker, but 2 different passes on the regular machine. Technically, it isn't critically necessary to zigzag the seam allowances since jersey knit fabric of this style doesn't tend to fray apart, but it does tend to curl up. So having the seam allowances curled up inside your shirt means it's going to have a bit of bulk that isn't going to be as flat as if you had zigzagged it. For the neckline, I gave it a quick measure around to see what we're working with, and that ended up being 23 inches in my case. And from here, we want to figure out what is 80 to 85% of that measurement and cut a narrow strip to match, and that'll become our neck binding. For knit fabrics like this, we need to go just a little bit smaller than the measured neckline to account for the stretch of the fabric. Then we will fold that narrow piece in half and then stitch the end so it's going to become a circle or a tube, and then we're going to iron it in half the other way so that it's nice and tidy. Next, I'm going to measure the 4/4 of the neck piece. In an ideal world, you would probably use those points to very precisely match up the center front and the center back of your shirt on the collar, but I just kind of eyeballed a starting location and then picked a spot that seemed about 50% across the other way, and then eyeballed the midpoints between those two starting pins. And I, of course, have helpfully not at all filmed that very clearly, but something kind of like this is the goal: an approximately evenly spaced out set of pins around the neckline. This is a step where the home machine was actually a little bit nicer to use because of the ability to remove the accessory bin and access that smaller free arm, while the Serger bed can get bigger with the detachable bed, but it cannot get smaller. Next up is the side seam that goes all the way from the cuff of the sleeve to the armpit and then down to the hips. I'm so used to sewing garments that require set-in sleeves that it is honestly kind of a treat to just do the sleeve and side seam all in one go. For the bottom hem of the shirt, I folded it in by 1 inch and then ironed that fold in place. Hemming was fun as well because I got to break out the twin needle on my regular sewing machine, which I don't often use, but it is nice for this because it has a little bit of that necessary stretch that we want and produces the pretty double row of stitching that looks visually similar to what we often see on commercial t-shirt finishing. Same deal for the sleeves. I folded it down 1 inch and then ironed it in place, and again, this is one where definitely having that free arm is just absolutely so handy versus the bigger bed of the cover stitch. It is perfectly possible to sew the sleeves on the bigger bed, absolutely. It just means I need to go a little bit more slowly and carefully. I now have a pair of darn near identical shirts. I think in my mind I was picturing that there'd be like obvious signs that one was sewn on a serger versus one on a regular sewing machine, but on the outside, not so much. They look pretty dang close. Now, interior wise, of course, yes, they absolutely do look different. I think that while they are both perfectly, beautifully functional in their seam treatments, the serger is decidedly very, very tidy. The way that it cuts the seam allowance as it's overcasting is just hard to beat when it comes to the regular sewing machine, unless you do something like a French seam or a flat felled seam, or you go for a completely different style. So they are tools that can do a lot of similar things, but they each have like their strengths. And I would say a serger's strength is beautifully, cleanly overcasting those lovely little edges, which just looks very, very tidy in a way that I appreciate. Whereas I would say a regular sewing machine's strength is versatility. I can switch between a ton of different stitches super fast. I can change feet super fast, all doing very specific things. The serger does its overcasting job really, really well. That's what it does. If you are like me and you've been avoiding sewing with knits because you just have a regular sewing machine and you felt like it might not be up to the job, I would say give it a try. Exterior wise, they look really, really close, and functionally they are performing the same. I would implore you to give knits a try if it's something that you've been interested in doing. I did end up making this a scooch bigger than I had intended. I think that's the downside of not already having an in-place knit pattern to work from, but I think I did all right for winging it. I had a lot of fun learning about how to work with knits, but I do recognize that my overlocker serger situation is probably predominantly going to be used in the future for overcasting on woven fabrics, because that's the majority of what I like to sew with. I did have someone ask me if I was going to be using it for like historical type projects, which I do a lot of, and I think the answer is it depends. It's the same thing when I sew with my regular sewing machine. Sometimes I'm doing internal seams that are covered with like a lining and something, in which case, heck yeah, machine sewn all the way. Overlocked? Great, wonderful. If I'm doing some sort of historical type project for the purposes of exploring like a certain sewing technique that was of the time, then I'm going to do that by hand because that's the point of that project. And on the other end of things, if I've got an event in a week that I need a new garment for, that serger is probably going to come so in handy, and I will just accept that the interior is going to look a little bit more modern. Different tools have their time and place, I think is really what that answer comes down to. I'm back because I realized that I didn't actually talk very much about who won the race between the two machines. Now for some steps, the Serger is absolutely faster, both because it is able to perform the equivalent of multiple steps in one stitch, one go, and it's just literally a fast machine. Like, I have it set to half speed just to kind of keep the training wheels on, and it's speedy. For some steps, the regular sewing machine was faster, mostly because of that free arm and the ability to manipulate fabric a lot more easily where I needed to be, especially for things like the neckline and the ends of sleeves. In total, if we skip any of the steps that weren't the actual stitching involved, the sewing machine took 38 minutes to make the shirt, and the Serger took 28 minutes, 10 minutes less, which makes it to the clear winner. Although, if you add back in the 8 almost minutes that it took me to go from the overlock to the cover stitch or vice versa, they start to look a little bit more even at that point, which I think just goes to show that the real winner of today's video is folks who have a separate overlocker and cover stitch machine. Speaking of which, I did absolutely consider that. Probably would have been cheaper too, considering, especially if you go refurbished, you can easily get one of each for like $500 per at the moment if you go shopping online. But I'm stubborn and decided that I really, really wanted a combo machine. So it's kind of funny because I have been saving up for a few years now with the intent of getting an industrial type sewing machine with like a fancy knee lift and everything. But I kept on not actually buying anything because it feels redundant when I already have a perfectly functional, you can't see it, it's off screen, regular sewing machine. Like, why would I need another one? So, you know, I kept on not actually doing it despite kind of wanting to. But when you guys in my last video chatted me up in the comments all about Sergers and what you like and don't like and everything, like, the consensus seems to be that yes, they are fantastic, and if you do like a lot of apparel sewing, they can really have a great spot in your lineup. And my local Husqvarna sewing shop, like dealership, might have been having a 50% off sale, and I decided, instead of a very fancy industrial type sewing machine, I got myself a very fancy Serger / overlocker / cover stitch. By the way, if you're curious what I'm up to, I am actually cutting up some of Mr. Morgandanner's old t-shirts that either don't fit him anymore or they've got stains or rips or whatever, but they're still mostly good. I am cutting them into pieces, and then I'm going to get rid of any of the more damaged parts and then cobble together the good parts and make new shirts. I have got to say I was knee-deep in sewing terms while making this video because you may have noticed that I have pretty interchangeably referred to this as either a serger or an overlocker, and that is because they are interchangeable terms. It's the same thing. I did technically see one reference indicating that to serge means that you are cutting the edge in addition to then binding it, while overlocking, I guess technically, while it often includes cutting to clean up the edge, it doesn't have to. Kind of a all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares type situation. But the actual practical reality, from what I can tell, is they're completely interchangeable, and it's maybe a little bit more common in the US to say serger, and in a lot of other places, overlocker is more common. Now, a cover stitch, on the other hand, is absolutely a totally different thing because it uses the top needles to create what looks kind of like a straight stitch on a regular sewing machine, but it uses the loopers on the bottom to create a net or web of thread to cover up the raw edge of the fabric, which is really, really great for doing hems of like sleeves and shirts and things like that. And we do not use the cutter for that. We're going to rotate that down because you want to keep that folded edge intact. You don't want to cut it off. I did not intend for this video to be a sergers versus sewing machines, who will win, but that is somehow kind of where we ended up. I just wanted to toy around with my new sewing tool, get to know it a little bit, get some practice in. I made another shirt, by the way, and share that with you guys. But since we're in the land of comparison anyway, I guess I will say that while a serger, overlocker, cover stitch machine is absolutely 100% not a necessity, it is nice. Even when it comes to sewing things like knit fabrics, which I've recently learned works just fine on my regular sewing machine, some parts are even easier to do there. It's so much more cleanly completed on the serger that I think it's worth the fussiness. It's worth the effort. And I think the actual end result of all this is I'm really excited to have both of them in my arsenal, because I feel like it's almost never going to be a question of, do I want to do a whole project on this or a whole project on that? It's almost always probably going to be like, what individual steps do I want to bounce back and forth between the two on? You know what I mean? Like, yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun.